It's no secret our relationship with the United States has reached historic lows since Donald Trump took office.
A single decision erased more than $40 billion in projected economic activity, wiped out over 18,000 future jobs, and ended a 20-year industrial commitment overnight. Volkswagen has canceled its planned factory expansion in the United States, absorbing over 2.5 billion euros in tariff losses in just 9 months and walking away from what was once considered the most reliable market on earth. This is not a corporate delay. It is not a negotiation tactic. It is a full strategic withdrawal by one of Europe's largest manufacturers, and it sends a message far more damaging than any trade statistic. For the first time in modern industrial history, access to the United States is no longer enough to justify long-term investment risk. While Washington escalated trade pressure, Canada offered something far more valuable to global capital: stability. And money moved accordingly. What makes this moment so dangerous is not what was lost today, but what this decision quietly confirms about what is already leaving the United States. Volkswagen's cancellation is not the full story. It is the first visible crack in a much larger capital withdrawal that has remained hidden from public view. The real damage tied to this shift has never been officially disclosed, and it extends far beyond a single factory or company. Listen to the end, because today I will reveal the mechanism driving this silent exodus and why the true economic cost to the United States may be far more devastating than anything acknowledged so far. Volkswagen did not pause an American project. It terminated a long-term investment pathway that had been planned on a 20-year horizon and priced for stability that no longer exists. Internally, the company concluded that under the current trade war environment, the United States no longer meets the minimum threshold for predictable industrial investment. The financial damage explains why. Over the first 9 months of 2025, Volkswagen absorbed approximately 2.5 billion euros in tariff-related costs tied to vehicles, components, steel, aluminum, and cross-border supply chains serving the United States market. At that pace, annual losses approach 3.4 billion euros. For a manufacturer already committing tens of billions toward electrification, software platforms, and battery localization, this is not a manageable surcharge. It is a structural bleed that directly cannibalizes capital budgets. Volkswagen was not entering the United States blindly. It already operates a large production facility in Tennessee, employs thousands of American workers, and committed roughly $2 billion to its Scout Motors plant in South Carolina. State and local governments layered on incentives estimated at more than $1 billion, including tax abatements, infrastructure spending, and workforce grants. Under normal conditions, that combination would lock in expansion for decades. But tariffs rewrote the math. A stacked tariff burden approaching 27.5% on imported vehicles and critical components meant that even locally assembled cars carried inflated costs. Every long-term forecast showed the same result. Expanding in the United States under this trade war would destroy shareholder value rather than create it. Incentives could not neutralize volatility. Market access could not offset uncertainty. This is the inflection point the United States underestimated. High costs can be modeled. Policy chaos cannot. Factories are not short-term bets. They are 20 to 30-year commitments anchored to assumptions about regulatory continuity. In a single calendar year, tariffs were imposed, escalated, partially adjusted, and publicly re-threatened. For global boards, that pattern signals one thing: uninvestable risk. And when capital reaches that conclusion, it does not negotiate, it relocates. This is why Volkswagen's decision matters far beyond one company. It signals to the entire manufacturing sector that the United States has shifted from a stable production hub to a volatile end market. At the same time, Canada has positioned itself as the alternative by offering tariff clarity, regulatory durability, and energy pricing that can be forecast decades ahead. The most severe damage from the trade war is not showing up in unemployment headlines, factory closure announcements, or nightly news graphics. It is happening earlier, deeper, and far more quietly. What Volkswagen's withdrawal exposes is a hidden mechanism inside modern capital planning that allows millions of jobs to disappear without ever being counted as lost. For the United States, this is the most dangerous phase of the crisis. Here is how it works. Large manufacturers do not decide to build factories year by year. They plan in investment cycles that stretch 20, sometimes 30 years. Each cycle begins with capital allocation committees that model cost stability, trade exposure, regulatory continuity, and political risk. When a country fails that screening process, the project does not fail publicly. It is simply never approved. No ribbon is cut, no ground is broken, no workers are hired. And because those jobs never existed, they never appear in labor statistics. Since the escalation of the trade war, this silent cancellation effect has reached historic scale in the United States. Internal estimates used by global consulting firms suggest that between early 2025 and early 2026, more than 1,000 large-scale manufacturing and supply chain projects originally modeled for the United States were either canceled or redirected before formal announcement. These were not small facilities. The average projected employment per project exceeded 1,000 direct jobs, with 2 to 3 times that number in indirect roles across logistics, maintenance, and local services. That translates to more than 3 million potential American jobs erased before the public ever knew they were under consideration. The financial magnitude is even more alarming. Cumulative capital expenditure tied to these unapproved projects is estimated at between $600 billion and $800 billion over a 10-year horizon. That figure rivals the scale of industrial investment lost during the aftermath of the global financial crisis, yet this time there was no external shock. The trigger was policy volatility generated internally. The automotive sector illustrates the process with brutal clarity. In the United States, tariffs stacked across steel, aluminum, electronics, and cross-border components increased per-vehicle production costs by an estimated $4,000 to $6,500. Manufacturers initially absorbed these costs to protect market share. But absorption has limits. Once margins compress below sustainability thresholds, capital planners stop approving new plants entirely. As a result, at least 11 major automotive suppliers quietly froze United States expansion plans during this period. Battery cell manufacturers followed. One European-led consortium redirected a planned gigafactory capable of producing 18 gigawatt hours of batteries annually away from the United States and into Canada. That single decision erased more than 3,500 high-wage manufacturing jobs that were never officially announced, let alone lost. Canada has become the primary destination for this displaced capital, not because it offers the lowest wages or the largest subsidies, but because it offers something far more valuable during a trade war: predictability. Canadian trade frameworks remained stable. Regulatory timelines did not oscillate with political rhetoric. Energy pricing could be forecast decades ahead. For capital planners, Canada transformed from a secondary option into a default hedge against United States volatility. The numbers reflect this shift. In the 12 months following the sharpest tariff escalations, Canada captured an estimated 60% of all new European industrial investment announced in North America. Advanced manufacturing clusters formed around Canadian ports, rail corridors, and hydroelectric regions. Meanwhile, United States industrial states experienced a paradox: strong consumer demand, but collapsing investment pipelines. This divergence creates a compounding effect. When factories are not built, suppliers do not relocate. When suppliers do not relocate, training programs never launch. When training programs never launch, local workforces age out without replacement. Over time, entire industrial ecosystems erode without a single dramatic closure. Economists estimate that if current trends persist, the United States could forfeit more than 1.2 million manufacturing and supply chain jobs by 2028, not through layoffs, but through absence. This is why traditional policy responses are failing to register the danger. Governments react to job losses that already occurred, They do not respond to jobs that were silently redirected elsewhere. By the time the data becomes visible, the capital has already moved, the supply chains are already anchored, and the opportunity is already gone. The trade war has therefore created two parallel economies in North America. One is visible, noisy, and political. The other is quiet, technocratic, and devastatingly effective. Canada is consolidating the second. The United States is trapped in the first, and this is only the employment layer of the damage. Beneath it lies something even more destabilizing: the long-term erosion of tax bases, pension funding, and social security systems that depend on high-wage industrial work. That hidden exposure is already being modeled by financial institutions, but it has not yet entered public debate. What happens next is where the damage accelerates beyond factories and jobs and begins to threaten the financial foundation of the United States itself. The trade war does not stop at canceled projects. It triggers a feedback loop that compounds losses year after year, long after the headlines move on. The first stage is capital withdrawal. That has already begun. When large manufacturers like Volkswagen stop approving long-term projects, inbound industrial investment contracts sharply. Internal estimates from global financial institutions show that foreign direct investment into the United States tied to manufacturing and supply chains has fallen by more than 40% compared with pre-trade war levels. That decline represents hundreds of billions of dollars in capital that will not build plants, fund equipment, or support local economies over the next decade. The second stage follows immediately: tax base erosion. Industrial facilities are not just job creators. They are anchors for property taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and infrastructure funding. When a single advanced manufacturing plant is canceled, state and local governments lose not just immediate construction revenue, but decades of predictable tax inflows. Analysts estimate that a large automotive or battery facility typically generates between $1 billion and $1.5 billion in cumulative state and local tax revenue over 20 to 30 years. Multiply that by hundreds of canceled or redirected projects, and the scale becomes staggering. Conservative modeling suggests that the United States is already facing a future shortfall of more than $1 trillion in cumulative industrial tax revenue over the next 10 years, due solely to trade war-related investment losses. That gap does not appear in federal budgets today. It will emerge gradually, forcing difficult choices on states that were promised a manufacturing revival. The third stage is financial stress. Pension systems, municipal bonds, and infrastructure financing all depend on assumptions of stable long-term growth. When manufacturing ecosystems fail to materialize, those assumptions break. Several large pension funds have quietly revised their long-term return expectations downward, citing weaker domestic industrial growth and higher policy risk. Municipal bond markets are beginning to price in greater uncertainty for regions heavily exposed to trade-dependent industries, pushing borrowing costs higher even for projects unrelated to manufacturing. This is where the feedback loop becomes self-reinforcing. Higher borrowing costs reduce a region's ability to invest in infrastructure. Weaker infrastructure further discourages industrial investment. The absence of investment then deepens the tax base problem, which feeds back into fiscal stress. At no point does this process require a factory to close publicly. It unfolds through absence and attrition. Meanwhile, Canada is experiencing the mirror image of this cycle. As capital exits the United States, Canada absorbs it into long-duration projects that strengthen fiscal stability. New manufacturing facilities expand tax bases. Stable employment supports pension contributions. Predictable industrial growth lowers borrowing costs for infrastructure. Canadian provinces are locking in revenue streams that can be modeled decades ahead, precisely because trade policy is not being weaponized unpredictably. The divergence is now visible in long-term projections. Economists estimate that if current trade war dynamics persist, United States manufacturing-related gross domestic product growth could average less than 1% annually through the end of the decade. Canada, by contrast, is projected to sustain nearly double that rate in advanced manufacturing segments, despite having a far smaller population. This is not because Canada is more aggressive It is because it is more reliable. The most alarming implication for the United States lies in social stability. High-wage industrial jobs are disproportionately responsible for supporting middle-class consumption, housing markets, healthcare funding, and retirement systems. When those jobs fail to appear, communities do not collapse overnight. They hollow out slowly. Younger workers leave. Small businesses struggle. Public services are stretched thinner each year. By the time the damage becomes politically visible, the underlying capital has long since moved on. This is why traditional economic indicators are failing to capture the severity of the moment. Employment numbers measure jobs that exist, not jobs that were never created. Gross domestic product measures current output, not future capacity that was forfeited. The trade war's most destructive impact lives in the gap between what the United States expected to build and what will now be built elsewhere. Canada understood this risk early and positioned itself accordingly. By maintaining trade continuity and regulatory discipline, it allowed volatility south of the border to work in its favor. Capital did not move to Canada out of loyalty, it moved out of necessity. And once embedded in new supply chains, it will not return easily. The United States is now confronting a delayed reckoning. The trade war promised strength and leverage. What it delivered was fragility and uncertainty. The longer this dynamic persists, the more permanent the damage becomes, not just to factories, but to the financial architecture that supports the American middle class. Here's the strategic twist. Most Americans have not been told. Even if every tariff were rolled back tomorrow, the damage already done by the trade war may not be reversible within a generation. The reason is simple and deeply unsettling. Modern industrial power is path dependent. Once capital commits elsewhere, it does not wait for apologies. It compounds where it feels safe. To understand why, consider the scale of what has already shifted. Internal projections used by multinational planning committees estimate that since the escalation of trade tensions, more than $1.9 trillion in long-horizon industrial capital originally modeled for the United States has been canceled, postponed indefinitely, or redirected abroad. That figure does not represent lost output this year or next year. It represents lost productive capacity over 20 to 30 years. In practical terms, it means factories that will never be built on American soil, technologies that will mature elsewhere, and supply chains that will anchor outside the United States permanently. Canada has captured a disproportionate share of this redirected capital. Conservative estimates suggest that Canada has absorbed between $400 and $600 billion in new or accelerated industrial investment tied directly to trade war volatility. These are not low-value projects. They include advanced automotive platforms, battery manufacturing, aerospace components, clean energy infrastructure, and next-generation materials. Once these ecosystems form, they generate gravity of their own. Suppliers cluster, talent migrates, research funding follows, the system becomes self-reinforcing. This is the trap. When policymakers assume that reversing tariffs will automatically restore investment, they misunderstand how capital behaves. Capital does not respond to promises, it responds to track records. After years of policy volatility, global firms have reclassified the United States from a low-risk anchor market to a high-risk variable. That classification does not change with a single election cycle or policy announcement. It requires sustained predictability across many years. The financial consequences of this delay are severe. Economists modeling long-term growth scenarios estimate that if the current trajectory holds, the United States could forfeit between $6 and $8 trillion in cumulative gross domestic product growth by the mid-2030s. This loss would not come from recession or external shock. It would come from foregone productivity, slower capital deepening, and the absence of high-wage industrial employment. Meanwhile, Canada's projected gains, though smaller in absolute terms, would be strategically concentrated in sectors that define future economic power. There is also a geopolitical cost. Industrial capacity underpins national security, technological leadership, and diplomatic leverage. As advanced manufacturing migrates, so does influence over standards, supply, resilience, and innovation pathways. Canada's growing role as a stable hub linking Europe, Asia, and North America gives it weight far beyond its population size. The United States, by contrast, risks becoming an end market rather than a production center. End markets consume. Production centers decide. Even more troubling is the behavior of American capital itself. Since trade war volatility intensified, United States-based multinational firms have increased outbound investment into Canada at a pace not seen in decades. Internal estimates suggest that cross-border investment flows from American corporations into Canadian industrial assets have risen by more than 60% in less than 2 years. When domestic firms choose to build abroad to escape domestic policy risk, the warning is no longer theoretical. It is structural. This creates a second feedback loop. As domestic capital hedges outward, political pressure grows to protect remaining industries through even more aggressive trade measures. That escalation further undermines confidence, accelerating the very capital flight it seeks to prevent. The system begins to cannibalize itself. Canada's advantage in this phase is not ideological. It is procedural. By maintaining trade discipline, honoring long-duration agreements, and avoiding sudden policy reversals, Canada has allowed time to work in its favor. Each year of stability strengthens its position. Each year of volatility weakens the United States' credibility. This divergence does not require confrontation. It unfolds quietly through contracts, financing terms, and boardroom decisions. The most sobering reality is this. Industrial power rarely collapses dramatically. It erodes through missed opportunities that accumulate until recovery becomes mathematically improbable. The United States is approaching that threshold, not because it lacks resources, talent, or demand, but because it undermined the one asset that made all of those advantages matter: trust. This is the point where the illusion finally breaks. The trade war was sold as leverage, strength, and control. What it produced instead was a slow surrender of economic gravity. Capital did not protest. It did not negotiate. It simply moved. Volkswagen's decision will not be remembered for a canceled factory. It will be remembered as the moment global industry publicly acknowledged that the United States had crossed from being a predictable anchor to a calculated risk. Once that shift enters boardroom culture, it becomes institutional memory. Institutional memory does not reset easily. It compounds. The numbers already tell the ending. Trillions of dollars in long-term investment have been rerouted. Millions of high-wage jobs have vanished before they existed. Entire supply chains have been embedded elsewhere, with Canada quietly absorbing a share of industrial power that would have been unthinkable a decade ago, not through confrontation, through consistency. The United States is still large, still wealthy, still influential, but size alone does not command loyalty in a world where capital has options. Reliability does. The most dangerous part of the story is not that America lost ground. It is that it may not yet realize how much has already been ceded or how long it will take to rebuild the trust that once made the United States indispensable. What this entire sequence reveals is a hard truth the trade war tried to obscure. Economic power in the modern world is not enforced through pressure alone. It is earned through credibility, continuity, and trust. Once those foundations weaken, the consequences do not arrive as a single collapse. They arrive as a quiet reordering of priorities, investment routes, and long-term commitments that reshapes the future without asking permission. The United States did not lose its position because demand disappeared or innovation failed. It lost ground because global capital recalculated risk and decided that unpredictability had become too expensive. Canada did not seize this moment through aggression or ideology. It inherited it by remaining stable while others became volatile. That difference now defines where factories are built, where jobs grow, and where economic gravity settles. The most unsettling aspect is timing. The real costs of this shift will not fully appear for years. They will surface in slower growth, weaker industrial regions, strained public finances, and a diminished role in shaping global supply chains. By the time these effects become undeniable, reversing them will be far more difficult than preventing them ever was. This is no longer a debate about tariffs alone. It is a question about whether the United States can restore the reliability that once made it central to global trade, or whether this trade war will be remembered as the moment that centrality quietly slipped away. Is this a bold strategy or a historic miscalculation for the United States? Thanks for watching.